There's your mics down there. Wow. Well, let's first talk about the short film, then we'll get to the longer film. First of all, I thought all the shorts were wonderful. What'd you guys think? Thought they were wonderful. So nice to see young talent doing great work, especially narrative work. There's a lot of documentaries out there. I'm a documentary filmmaker myself, but good work for narrative. So I guess my question is, tell us a little bit about why you decided to make this movie. Was it personal? So her film was 20, right? Yeah. So just tell us a little bit how you came upon making the movie.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was interested in looking at how, I guess, children perceive events and perceive traumatic or dramatic familial events, and so that was really what inspired me to make this. I mean, watching your film, you see how people just have such different perceptions of history and what the memories they carry with them, and so that was just something I was trying to explore.
How did you come up with the story?
Well, I would say that it was partially inspired by my own life. My parents got divorced, and so that was kind of the original, I guess, thrust of it. But really, it wasn't my experience as much as it was just looking at how a child, Asa, who's actually in the audience right now, who
great
played
work,
Ben.
my friend.
Really
good little actor
work,
down there.
I would say, and I also have my DP in the audience, Asher Brown. So it was definitely a group effort and could not have been done without both of them. But I think that adults might not realize how much children take in, and that's something that I find interesting. And it's just how a child might grasp parts of something but not other parts, and what they observe, and that's what I was trying to explore.
How did you come up with the counting to 20?
That's a good question. I guess for that, it's coming of age story in its essence. I mean, and it's about how my protagonist Ben has to grow up in a sense, and has to maybe grow up a little sooner than he might otherwise have had to if this event didn't happen. And so in that moment, I was trying to find a way to show how he's protecting his younger sister. And so that served for that purpose of him seeing something that he didn't want her to necessarily see as well. And so a distraction as counting to 20. Yeah.
It was very nice. So where are you right out of college? Are you in film school? Where are you in your career?
Well, I went to Middlebury College, not too far from here. Yeah. My name is Mia. Thank you. Nice to meet you. And now I just graduated in the spring, and now I'm in Los Angeles. Yeah.
Trying to be a filmmaker. Yeah?
Or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interested primarily in directing, or?
Directing and writing. Yeah. So we'll see.
It was really nice. Yeah. The acting was wonderful. You guys were great. And I often say, it's sometimes harder making a short film than a longer film because you have to say a lot in a very short period of time. But I thought that you captured that world and the children's world, and how they connected to what was going on really beautifully. So
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, LeeAnn. So, wow, this movie was, intense, and I certainly learned a lot. I guess, let's start with the usual question that's always asked, which is, how did you get involved with this? Did you know Judy? I mean, how did you connect to this story?
So about 8 years ago, Fega's great-grandson is a friend of mine. His name is Steve Nathan. He is the director of the lung transplant program at Fairfax Hospital. And he brought me his great-grandmother's letter and thought that I might be interested in it and making it into a film. But I read it at the time and was very confused. I knew about World War II, but I didn't know about this period of violence, so I set it aside and thought, I'll go back to this at some point. A year later, my husband was diagnosed with a very rare form of blood cancer, And the day before he was to start chemo, he suffered a life-threatening stroke and ended up in the very same hospital where Steve works. And over the next couple of weeks in ICU, Steve would come in every day and go over Glenn's charts and keep me apprised of what was going on and really coordinated things. And he became my lifeline during a very difficult period. And my husband was in the hospital for a month, and he's recovered. And usually I bring him along, and he's in the back, and he'll stand up and wave, and everybody feels relieved.
We take your word for it.
Yes. But a year after this, Steve called me up and he said his cousin Judy was about to embark on this trip to Ukraine, and she had invited members of the family to go along. Well, Steve extended the invitation to me and asked if I wanted to go and do the film. So Judy gave me permission to go along. So I took out the letter again and read it, and I was struck by the fact that I had been impacted by events 100 years ago, because Steve was alive because of this decision that Fega made to give up these two kids. So here I was in Northern Virginia, impacted by these events 100 years ago. So it became a very personal film for me also. So that's how I came to it.
And that I think that reflection at the end of the film is so amazing, because of course any mother putting their kids into an orphanage is just heartbreaking, but then you realize the fact that she did that, and the fact that that guy in South Africa created the orphanage, and that then these children, even it was massive trauma. I'm sure there was lots of psychological stuff that all of those kids dealt with in their lives, but many of them did grow up, had a family, did good things, and then created grandchildren and everything. So you see that. It's very powerful, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. How fascinating that it became personal for you. There he was in the emergency room,
a non-Jew living in Northern Virginia, impacted by these events.
Right. And then also going back to what you said, the idea of how everyone is affected differently through a trauma in a family. And also I think the idea that Judy could sort of go there, her dad could not, because it was just, he couldn't do that. Talk a little bit about that, just, the different generational impacts and thoughts you have about that.
That really struck me early on. I have encountered at so many of the screenings that I've done with this film, people have come to me and said, this is my family's history, but I knew nothing about it because my father, my grandfather, whatever, would not speak of it. So people who are coming to me are just very grateful to learn about this impact on their individual families, because the trauma really does trickle through generations. And we're learning much more about this as scholars do research on the impact of trauma and how it can actually change the DNA of a child's brain and stay with them and get passed on. So it really does have generational impact.
Yeah, and part of the struggle with the pogroms and this whole history is that there was so much devastation, but also there was so little history. No one talked about it. So, people don't really know about it. We know all about, World War II, the Holocaust. We know about that, the Nazi movement. But really it was sort of stopped at its roots as far as really trying to resolve it or deal with it. And then when you also have people who went through it who don't want to talk about it, it's even harder.
Right. And because it was so chaotic at the time, the documentation is virtually non-existent. I mean, we do have the things at the Cherry Cover Archive in New York, but as you could see, so many of those documents, the accounts, were written on scraps of paper. There was very little to write on. You might flip something over and find an invoice or a bill of lading. It was whatever they could find to write something on. But because many of these small towns, there was nothing, there is no record of what happened. It's simply wiped out.
So has the Ukraine, those countries, have they apologized? Has there been any sense of...
No.
Yeah.
No. There is some coming to grips with it, but they're still fighting over what happened in the Holocaust. And they're still promoting Ukrainian freedom fighters who participated in the massacres. The Holocaust in Ukraine was not a Holocaust of gas chambers, it was a Holocaust of bullets. So what the Germans found, was a willing population that would come and assist them in shooting Jewish populations over pits. That was the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. So it was a very different Holocaust. And you still find that some of those perpetrators are heralded as heroes of World War II. And so there's a lot of controversy within Ukraine today, tearing down those monuments. We all know what that's like here.
Right, starting to happen here. Yep.
So they're going through that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I did think a lot about the slavery issue and the years of torture of that's really our legacy here in the United States. And in my opinion, we really, in so many ways, have not truly apologized, dealt with it, done what we needed to do around it. What was the one thing that you really struck you in making this film that you learned that really stays with you?
Man's capacity to be cruel to one another. I was asked this once at a conference, and without even thinking about it, I started to cry and said that because I had just recently found that Red Cross hospital footage that is so clear. And I was struck, and there's so much that we didn't show because it is terribly graphic, but it's terribly graphic. People did this to each other. It was stunning to me, just stunning.
And this may be an extremely ignorant question, and I know it was talked about a little bit in the movie, but I don't understand why there was such an anti-Jewish, why the Jewish people were so, looked at as the bad guys. I mean, what the hell were they doing? They were just living their lives. I mean, why were they so targeted? A
little piece of Jewish history. Russia came to have its large Jewish population with the dissolution of the Polish Commonwealth, which was divided up. And during the time of Catherine the Great, they acquired part of Poland and then had the largest population of Jews in the world. Russian merchants were rather jealous and wanted to protect their markets. So Catherine the Great established what was called the Pale of Settlement, an area in Russia to which Jews were confined. And they were also restricted as to what jobs they could have. They were not allowed to own land. They couldn't farm. They became the merchants. They became the tax collectors for the Polish landlords who owned the land that the peasants worked on. So the peasants saw them, the Jews, as taking their money. So it really did, it was just an institutional, and really, it lasted for years.
And of course, you also have the whole thing that I think we see a little bit what that's going on now. If you just spread a lie about Jewish people are bad, refugees are bad, they're all bad, then if you keep saying that over and over and over again, there's a certain part of the population that will believe it, and they will do anything to go against those people.
Yeah.
So I think that felt like that was also it. Like there was just so much rhetoric around this that.
Absolutely.
Right?
And because Jews were confined to this particular area, there were large sections of the country that really knew nothing about the Jewish population. There were some Jews who were allowed to go live in the major cities, but for the most part, they were very isolated.
Mm-hmm. So, questions, thoughts? Yes. Can you talk a little louder?
I said it was a very, very, very good film, very educational and good, but I'm sure you're asked this question all the time.
I can almost
When
predict
to
it.
see his mother.
Yes.
Why was it only one day? Besides the language and everything else, was it just the emotional?
Yeah, we know very little about this visit, and what we do know comes from that videotaped interview with his wife, Nora, that was done in 2003. She was the only one to discuss it. He talked to her about it, and the family lore is that they couldn't communicate, but Fega lived on a kibbutz, and it just had to be that there were people around who could translate for them, so that one doesn't hold water for me at all. We do know from Nora that Manny went to sleep that night, and when he woke up, he discovered that Fega had sat by his bedside all night and watched him. And he was just creeped out by this and just decided he couldn't stay. This is very heartbreaking.
So that was the only information that you got?
That's all I have, yeah.
And you would think, and she lived to be quite an age.
Yeah.
How old was she?
She actually died, I think she was 56 when she died.
How did she get out of, how did she get to, where was she?
She was in Palestine. Her
Right.
daughter had immigrated years
Okay.
before and petitioned to have Fega come join her.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yes.
Yeah, I think an impact, a pretty good, the movie was great, by the way.
Thank you.
But I never realized, both of my wife and myself, great-grandparents and grandparents came from that area. I knew my great-grandfather really well, and we were lucky to have our grandfathers for a long time. They came between 1900 and 1908 and never really explained why. But I think you're letting us know probably why.
During that period, most of the exodus was economic, but there certainly was the fear of pogroms at that time. The death toll during that period was much, much lower than the Civil War period, but it was absolutely a fear of many Jews that they would become victims of this violence.
Yes.
This is a weird association with the three movies. I don't even know if this was intentional, but it was striking to me, especially with the first one, that, you know, it was sort of the man's fault, you know, he wasn't helping his wife. Then you've got, you know, your movie with 20 where, you know, he's sort of the one who strayed and the kids can see from his text. And then just all these atrocities perpetrated by young boys, men, very few women in the movie except for the sort of people trying to find out what happened. It's just, you know, striking that it just seems like a lot of these things are, I don't know what to say it, but it just seems kind of funny, the connection between all three about that.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenging things, that these, a lot of these bands of people who would come into the towns were so young. They were 13, 14. So the thing that I kept thinking is the trauma upon the trauma. Even the people who were perpetrating this stuff, can you imagine what their lives were like? I mean, at age 13, killing people. I mean, you do not grow up a happy person. So there were just like what you said. I mean, just when you look at this, you're like, how can this possibly be happening? I mean, it's just so horrific. And I think that, you know, we often do look at the Holocaust or slavery. I mean, there are many, many horrible things that have happened around the world, but this is a part of history that we obviously need to know more about. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
I just had a comment for Leah that ties into, Michelle, what you just said. One of the pieces of your gem that I appreciated was the scene where the boy goes into the bedroom, where Dad's clearly getting ready to pack his bags, and he's got that knife. Yeah. And in the documentary that I watched the other day about the refugee children, also had a knife. And I'm thinking, ooh, that's really interesting. And I thought he was going to cut something up, but he didn't.
He took the time.
He did, but I thought he was going to slash the tie and slash his father's clothes. But interestingly, then you see this very gentle and caring side of him where he wants to protect his sister. And now I'm recalling, yeah, but he's got his trauma. He's slashing with a knife. That just makes me think of now, where is that potentially going to go? Because trauma is trauma.
Well, and
One other comment, if I can get it out without crying. So I've seen 2 movies about immigrants and orphans and war situations that create these things. And we are living in a time when there is an administration in this country in 2019 there's a whole media that's going to tell you that it's all appropriate and this is an infest. What are we doing? What
Right,
are
we're keeping children in cages, we're taking them away from their parents.
Orphans, traumas,
Mhm.
stories.
Well, this is why I feel my film is relevant today. Absolutely. And we had finished just before Charlottesville, so that whole incident was stunning to me. But, you know, our film shows that the Holocaust did not occur in a vacuum, and there are plenty of people who today will argue that what we're seeing today isn't a big deal. I would argue that it is a big deal when we normalize this behavior and it just gets worse and worse. And each variation that gets worse is more normalized. Then we end up with these horrific events.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree, and I would say it's also about like misappropriated anger. I think you're growing up in generations, and I mean, the people who perpetrated these horrible crimes probably had things happen to them, and then they were told it was the Jewish people that they to blame, and that's what induces this kind of behavior. And it's kind of learning to take responsibility for your own actions, and then teaching your children to take responsibility for their own actions. And it's definitely a generational education. You have to pass it down.
Yes, yes.
So, both your films, both are a macro and a micro meditation, in my perspective, on trauma, pain, both at the personal level and at the global level. And we were talking yesterday about grim and dim documentaries and what we do to make it through. The important listening to those stories. But on the other side, we're still here. And, you know, I imagine you both imagine you have futures. What do you
Louder,
think?
please.
I'll repeat.
I imagine through your filmmaking that you're not just dealing with the past and the present, but you're thinking about the future. So what about the future gives you any kind of hope? Like what, you know, we know about violence, we know about the patriarchy, we know about the mechanisms for how this destruction happens. What, if anything, are you considering or has been stirred in you to give you some sort of hope, or maybe there's no hope? So I don't want to be.
So I'll repeat the question. So the bottom line is there for both filmmakers something, you know, you're making difficult films about difficult issues. Do you have hope for the future? Or what is your hope for the future? Or what do you see as hopeful in the future? Go ahead, as the youngin', you start first.
Yeah, okay.
Please tell us, please help us.
Hope for the future. I think it's almost impossible to it is impossible to predict the future. I think it is about learning from the past and about forgiveness. I think forgiveness is a huge part of it. And I think it's easy to hold anger, and it's much harder to move past it. And I think that we feel that everything is so polarized right now in our political system and social media, everything is polarized. And so it's about bridging that gap. I'm hopeful, I guess, at the end of the day that people are people and that you do share these basic shared experiences. I mean, the story I depicted versus what you depicted, drastically different, but both are centered around family, and that is such an integral part of being a human. And I think if you can distill those central motifs that everyone shares, I mean, that's going to help move us forward. But I mean, yeah, you have to have hope. How can you get up in the morning if you don't?
I put that last section in the film for that reason. I really wanted to show how it had impacted both Judy and her activism and her two children. I did a work in progress screening in Washington in the company of a very well-known documentarian who said, cut that section. It's superfluous. And all the young people in the audience said, no! And I kept it in, and I thought it was important to keep it in, that we show that even though there's trauma in these earlier generations, that the younger ones can take it and do something positive with it. And Tess and her brother are so inspirational to me that they're really working hard.
I would also add that I think traumatic experiences gives you perspective that you otherwise don't have. And then to embrace that and to use that as a way to see the world differently and shape it differently is the best you can hope for.
Yeah, I mean, I think the film also is a meditation on the fact that we have to deal with our past, and that that even though it's hard, unless we do deal with our past, we can't move forward. So I think that that's something that we need to get better at, instead of, pushing it away or not wanting to know. Because if it affects us and we have empathy, then we can create change. If we don't have empathy, then we can't connect to anybody else. So I think that's one issue. Couple more questions, yes.
Yes.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, the family gave me permission to reprint the. They had only printed enough copies for the family, but the family gave me permission to reprint it, and I have some copies with me, and it's also available on our website, which is mydearchildrendoc.com. Mydearchildren.com is some evangelical website, so don't go there. Don't go there.
So where are you showing this? I mean, obviously you're showing it in film festivals, but where else have you shown it?
So we have distribution through American Public Television. They picked it up and began airing it last September. We had a flurry of broadcasts around the Jewish holidays, and then again in April around Holocaust Remembrance Day. I think our broadcasts are pretty much done at this point. Vermont did not pick it up. WGBH did not pick it up. A lot of these larger television stations, WIDA didn't pick it up in D.C., but World aired it. So at this point, that gave us some nice exposure, and we're just doing a lot of screenings, film festivals, and I go to synagogues. I go to whoever wants me, I go. MyDearChildrenDoc.com. And we have a Facebook page, too.
One more question? Yes, back there.
Hi, I don't know if you've seen this or not, but there's a PBS show with Henry Louis Gates, Finding Our Roots, and he did a sit-down with Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders' dad's family story is very much part of the story that you're telling. In terms of drawing connections between like the relevance of these stories and their connection to motivations for historical change right now, that's a really powerful connection.
Maybe we can get Bernie to promote the film then for us.
Get him, send him a copy of it, for sure. Yeah. Okay, thank you all so much for coming, and thank the filmmakers. Wonderful. Thank you.